The fire had been dead for 3 hours, but Severin Blackwood's cabin was still warm enough that he needed no coat, as dawn light filtered through the frosted windows. He knelt beside the ring of stones embedded in his floor, hands hovering over the surface several feet from where the flames had burned, feeling heat radiate upward like summer sun on rock. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if frontier ingenuity like this speaks to you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story might just change how you see survival itself. Severin Blackwood had survived 5 winters in the Dakota Territory, which meant he had woken in darkness approximately 750 times to feed a fire that refused to stay alive on its own. It was February 1853, and he was awake again at midnight, adding split logs to the fireplace while his wife Rosamond and 6-year-old son Anselm slept on the raised bed platform against the far wall. The cabin measured 16 feet by 20 feet, with log walls chinked against the wind and a single window shuttered tight against the cold. The fireplace occupied one corner, built from river stone and clay mortar, drawing smoke up through a chimney that extended 2 feet above the roofline. It was adequate construction, typical of homestead cabins across the northern frontier, and it kept them alive through winters that regularly saw temperatures fall below zero for weeks at a time. But adequate was not the same as efficient, and survival was not the same as comfort. Severin had learned this distinction through experience that measured itself in exhaustion and constant vigilance. A fire left untended for more than 3 hours would die to coals insufficient to warm the space. The temperature inside the cabin would drop rapidly, cold seeping through every gap in the chinked logs, rising through the floorboards, descending from the rafters. By morning, water in the bucket would freeze solid. Bedding would be stiff with frost. The danger was real and immediate. Families had frozen to death in their sleep when fires went out during severe cold snaps. It happened every winter somewhere in the territory. A settler would fall ill or simply sleep too deeply after days of exhaustion, and the fire would die, and by morning it would be too late. So Severin woke every 2 to 3 hours, as did Rosamond when he was away checking traplines or hunting. They took turns through the long winter nights, rising in darkness, stumbling to the fireplace, adding wood, stirring coals, waiting until flames caught properly before returning to bed. The routine was grinding. It fragmented sleep into useless segments. It meant neither of them ever felt truly rested between November and March. It required enormous quantities of wood. Severin estimated they burned through a cord of split firewood every 10 days during the coldest months, which meant he spent substantial portions of autumn cutting, splitting, and stacking wood to sustain them through winter. Every settler accepted this as the cost of frontier life. You built a cabin, you installed a fireplace, and you woke up multiple times every night for 5 months to keep your family from freezing. There was no alternative. It was simply how things were done. Severin added a final log to the fire and watched until the bark caught and flames spread across the new fuel. The cabin warmed slightly. He returned to bed, knowing he would wake again before dawn to repeat the process. Tomorrow night would be the same, and the night after that, and every night until spring. Late January 1853 brought weather cold enough that frost formed on the interior walls of the cabin, despite the fire burning constantly. Severin had left at dawn to check his trapline, a circuit that took him 8 miles through timber along the creek bottoms where beaver and muskrat dens remained active through winter. He expected to return by mid-afternoon. Rosamond stayed at the cabin with Anselm, tending the fire, preparing meals, managing the domestic work that kept a frontier household functional. She was capable and experienced, having managed alone during Severin's absences many times over the past 5 years. But that morning, Rosamond woke feeling unwell, a headache that intensified as the day progressed. Fever that came on suddenly, making her weak and disoriented. By noon, she was struggling to stand. By early afternoon, she was lying on the bed platform, shivering despite the fire, trying to stay conscious while Anselm sat beside her, asking questions she could barely answer. The fire needed wood. She knew this. She could see the flames diminishing, could feel the temperature in the cabin beginning to drop. She tried to rise, managed to sit up, but dizziness overwhelmed her, and she collapsed back onto the bedding. Anselm was 6 years old, too young to manage the fireplace safely, too small to lift the split logs from the woodpile outside. The fire died to coals around sunset. The coals faded to ash by full darkness. The temperature inside the cabin began dropping immediately, cold flowing in through every microscopic gap in the construction. Within 2 hours, the interior temperature matched the exterior, which was approaching 20 degrees below zero. Frost formed on the log walls. The water bucket developed a skin of ice that thickened steadily. Anselm crawled under the blankets with his mother, pressing against her for warmth, frightened but not understanding the full danger. Rosamond drifted in and out of feverish consciousness, aware something was wrong but unable to form coherent thoughts or take action. The cold deepened through the night hours. Severin returned at dawn to find the cabin silent and cold as a tomb. The door was not barred from inside, which sent immediate alarm through him. He pushed it open and saw the dead fireplace, the frost-covered interior, his wife and son motionless under blankets stiff with frozen condensation. He thought for a terrible moment that he was too late. Then Anselm stirred, whimpering, and Severin moved. He carried them both to the fireplace, built a fire with shaking hands, wrapped them in dry blankets from the chest. Rosamond's skin was gray and cold. Her breathing was shallow. Anselm was crying, but responsive, which meant he would recover. She survived. The exposure left her weakened in ways that would persist for months. Her hands suffered mild frostbite damage. Her resistance to illness was compromised, and Severin understood with absolute clarity that the fire-tending requirement was not an inconvenience to be accepted. It was a fundamental design flaw that had nearly killed his family. Something had to change. Severin became obsessed with the heating problem in a way that worried Rosamond and puzzled his neighbors. He spent hours staring at the fireplace, analyzing why it failed so completely at the one task that mattered most: maintaining warmth through the night without constant human intervention. The answer was obvious once he focused on it. The fireplace generated heat efficiently enough while fire burned, but it stored nothing. Every bit of thermal energy went immediately into the air or up the chimney. When the fire died, the heat vanished within minutes. The stone structure retained some warmth, but not enough to matter. By dawn, the stones were as cold as everything else. He started visiting neighbors under various pretexts, studying their heating systems. Ulrich Brennan had a larger fireplace built with better stone. It failed the same way. Barnabas Thorne had added a second fireplace at the opposite end of his cabin. He just had to tend 2 fires instead of 1. Caspar Reinhardt had tried building a fire pit in the center of his cabin with a smoke hole in the roof. It worked marginally better for heat distribution, but still required constant feeding and filled the cabin with smoke whenever wind directions changed. Everyone accepted that you built a fire, you tended it constantly, and you burned enormous quantities of wood to stay alive through winter. No one questioned whether a better method existed. Severin questioned everything. He started thinking about heat not as something you generated continuously, but as something you could store and release gradually. The concept was not entirely foreign to him. He had worked in his grandfather's bakery in Pennsylvania as a young man before coming west. The brick ovens there were built with massive walls that absorbed heat during the firing process. Long after the fire was raked out, the ovens remained hot enough to bake bread. The bricks held the thermal energy and released it slowly over many hours. That was the principle he needed: thermal mass. Materials that could absorb large amounts of heat and release it gradually rather than immediately. He began experimenting with materials. He placed stones in the fireplace during burns, then removed them to see how long they stayed warm. Large, dense stones retained heat far longer than small ones. Flat stones with greater surface area radiated heat more effectively than rounded ones. He noticed that stones placed in direct sunlight on cold but clear winter days remained warm well after sunset, sometimes staying above freezing through the night, while everything around them froze solid. Stone had capacity to hold heat. The question was how to use that capacity in a way that would keep a cabin warm through the night. The idea came to him gradually rather than in a single moment of revelation. What if the floor itself was stone? What if you could heat the entire mass of the floor during the day and let it radiate warmth upward through the night? Heat rose naturally. A warm floor would heat the entire cabin volume efficiently, and if the floor was large enough and thick enough, it might hold sufficient thermal energy to maintain livable temperatures for 8 or even 10 hours after the fire died. Neighbors would think he was insane. He was fairly certain Rosamond would think he was insane, but the principle was sound. He just had to prove it. Spring 1853 arrived late, with snow lingering into April and the ground remaining frozen well into May. As soon as travel became feasible, Severin made a journey that puzzled everyone who knew about it. He left the homestead for 3 days, traveling to the nearest established town, a settlement called New Ulm, nearly 60 miles southeast. He told Rosamond he needed supplies. He told Ulrich Brennan he was investigating trade opportunities. Neither explanation was entirely false, but neither captured his actual purpose. He was going to study buildings. New Ulm had structures that frontier homesteads lacked: a brick courthouse, a stone church, a bakery with a proper masonry oven, a blacksmith's forge with carefully designed heat management. Severin spent 3 days walking through the town, observing construction techniques, asking questions of builders and craftsmen, studying how different materials absorbed and radiated heat. The courthouse had thick brick walls that stayed cool in summer and retained warmth in winter. The bakery oven, built by a German immigrant, had walls 8 inches thick that could bake bread for hours after the fire was extinguished. He talked to the baker extensively, learning about thermal mass properties. Dense materials absorbed heat slowly, but released it slowly as well. The key was having enough mass to store significant thermal energy. The baker explained that his oven walls weighed over 2,000 pounds. That mass, once heated, held enough energy to maintain baking temperatures for half a day. Severin asked about different stone types. Limestone and sandstone were good. Dense river rock was better. The principle remained consistent. Weight and density determined heat storage capacity. He observed that buildings with stone floors maintained more stable interior temperatures than those built directly on Earth. Stone exposed to sun absorbed heat during the day and released it at night. He watched how flat stones in the town square remained warm long after sunset, radiating heat upward while the air cooled rapidly. The physics were simple once explained. Heat moved from hot objects to cold objects. Dense materials absorbed more heat than light materials. Large surface areas radiated heat more effectively than small ones. A heated floor would warm a room far more efficiently than a heated wall because heat rose naturally. Severin purchased tools he would need for stonework: a heavy chisel for shaping, a mallet with iron head, a leveling instrument borrowed from surveying equipment. He bought these items with money saved from fur sales, spending what seemed like an excessive amount on tools that had no obvious application to farming or trapping. The merchant who sold them asked what he was building. Severin said he was improving his cabin. The return journey took 3 days. Severin rode slowly, thinking through every detail of what he planned to build: a stone floor covering the entire cabin interior, a shallow ring-shaped depression in that floor where fire could burn. Stones inside the ring that would absorb extreme heat and release it gradually. The system would be labor-intensive to construct, expensive in time, if not materials, and completely unprecedented in frontier building practices. His neighbors would mock him mercilessly. But if it worked, his family would never again face the terror of a dying fire on a freezing night. Summer construction season began in June when the ground finally thawed enough to work. Severin started his project by identifying a source for suitable stone. He found what he needed 3 miles from his cabin, a natural rock outcropping along a creek bed where flat slabs of dense limestone had been exposed by centuries of water erosion. The stones were not perfect, but they were workable. Each piece weighed between 60 and 80 pounds. He would need approximately 200 of them to cover his cabin floor with stones thick enough to provide meaningful thermal mass. He began hauling stone, 1 trip per day when weather permitted, loading his horse-drawn sledge with as many slabs as the animal could pull, transporting them to the homestead, unloading them near the cabin. The work was backbreaking and monotonous. Other settlers noticed immediately. Ulrich Brennan stopped by during the second week, watched Severin unload stones, and asked what possible purpose this served. Severin explained he was building a stone floor. Ulrich stared at him as if he had announced plans to build a castle. A stone floor in a frontier cabin? Why would anyone waste months of labor on something that provided no practical benefit? Dirt floors worked perfectly well. They cost nothing. They required no maintenance. Ulrich left shaking his head, and within days the entire scattered settlement community knew that Severin Blackwood had lost his mind. The mockery was immediate and widespread. Caspar Reinhardt visited and asked if Severin was planning to open a church. Barnabas Thorne, who had formal education and was generally respectful, suggested gently that perhaps Severin's time would be better spent on activities that generated income. Even Ezekiel Moss, the trader who visited homesteads twice yearly, commented that he had seen many strange things on the frontier, but never a man hauling stones to build a floor when perfectly good earth was already there. Rosamond supported him despite her own doubts. She had nearly died because their heating system failed. If Severin believed he could build something better, she would trust him. But she also watched their neighbors' reactions and worried about the social cost of being known as the family with strange ideas. By late July, Severin had hauled enough stone to begin construction. He excavated the dirt floor of the cabin, digging down 8 inches to create space for a gravel base that would provide drainage and prevent settling. He laid the gravel carefully, tamping it level. Then he began placing stones. Each one required individual attention. He examined the thickness, checked for cracks or weaknesses, shaped edges with his chisel where necessary to achieve tight fits. The gaps between stones needed to be minimal. Heat would escape through gaps. He mixed a mortar from clay and sand to fill joints, working it deep between stones with a wooden tool he carved for the purpose. The floor grew slowly, 10 square feet per week, 20 if he worked from dawn until dark and ignored other homestead duties. Neighbors continued visiting, continued expressing disbelief at the wasted effort. Severin worked steadily, saying little, focused on the vision only he could see. By September, the floor was complete. The true innovation could begin. With the stone floor complete, Severin began the central element of his design, the fire ring. He had planned its location carefully, positioning it slightly off-center in the cabin to account for the door location and furniture placement. The ring would be approximately 4 feet in diameter at its widest point, shaped irregularly rather than perfectly circular because he was working with natural materials and hand tools, not precision instruments. The shape mattered less than the function. What mattered was creating a depression where fire could burn while transferring maximum heat to the surrounding floor mass. He marked the ring boundary using charcoal, outlining an organic oval shape that looked deliberate despite its irregularity. Then he began the careful work of creating the depression. He could not simply dig into the floor he had just built. Instead, he removed stones from within the marked area, setting them aside. Beneath those stones was the gravel base. He excavated that as well, going down another 6 inches below the floor level. The result was a shallow bowl sunk into the floor, with edges that remained flush with the surrounding stone surface. The shallow depth was intentional and critical to his design. Deep fire pits trapped heat in a hole where it did no good. Shallow depressions allowed heat to radiate outward horizontally across the floor mass rather than escaping vertically. He wanted heat spreading through the stones, not rising uselessly into air. The ring shape provided maximum perimeter contact between the fire zone and the surrounding thermal mass. Every inch of the ring boundary was a transfer point where heat could move from superheated core to the broader floor. Next came selection of stones for inside the ring. These were different from the floor stones. He needed rocks that could withstand extreme direct heat without cracking or exploding. He had learned from the baker in New Ulm that certain stones contained moisture that would turn to steam under intense heat, causing them to fracture violently. He tested candidates by heating them in his fireplace, discarding any that showed cracks or produced hissing sounds. The survivors were dense river rocks with no visible flaws, each one roughly the size of a man's head. He placed these heat-retaining stones inside the shallow depression, arranging them to create an irregular pattern that left spaces for airflow necessary for combustion. The stones rested firmly on the excavated base, stable, and ready to absorb whatever heat fire could deliver. They would become the thermal batteries of his system, storing energy that would radiate through the floor long after flames died. Ulrich Brennan visited during the final stages of ring construction. He stared at the shallow depression, at the odd arrangement of stones, at the irregular shape that looked nothing like a proper fireplace. His assessment was immediate and dismissive. That is the silliest fire pit I have ever seen. Too shallow to hold a decent fire. Strange shape that serves no purpose. Stones taking up space where fuel should go. You have wasted an entire summer building something that will not work. Severin said nothing. He placed the final stone and prepared for the first test that would prove everything. October 1853 brought the first cold nights that required serious heating. Severin chose a clear afternoon when temperatures hovered just above freezing to conduct the first full test of his system. He had been using the fire ring for cooking purposes throughout September, brief fires that burned for an hour or two, but he had not yet attempted the true purpose of his design, heating the entire thermal mass to capacity and measuring how long it retained warmth. He built the fire carefully, starting with kindling placed among the stones inside the ring, adding progressively larger pieces of wood as flames established themselves. The fire grew quickly, filling the shallow depression with intense heat. Flames rose a foot above the floor level, spreading warmth immediately into the cabin air. But Severin was not interested in immediate warmth. He was interested in what would happen hours after the fire died. He fed the fire steadily for 3 hours, maintaining intense heat that made the stones inside the ring glow dull red. The heat was almost uncomfortable near the ring, forcing Rosamond and Anselm to stay near the walls. But Severin could feel warmth radiating through the entire floor. Walking barefoot, he could sense temperature differences. The stones immediately adjacent to the ring were hot enough to cause pain if touched. Stones 5 feet away were warm. Stones near the walls were noticeably warmer than they had been before the fire started. At sunset, he stopped adding wood. The fire burned down to coals, then to ash, then to nothing. Full darkness fell. The family prepared for sleep, uncertain what the night would bring. Severin had theories and calculations, but theory meant nothing until tested against reality. They went to bed with no active fire burning, something that violated every frontier survival instinct they possessed. Midnight arrived. Severin woke naturally, his body trained by 5 years of fire tending to rouse itself every few hours. He lay still, assessing. The cabin was not cold. He could see his breath, but barely. He stood and walked to the fire ring. No flames, no coals, nothing but dark stones and ash. He placed his hand on the floor 3 feet from the ring. The stone was warm enough that he could comfortably leave his hand there indefinitely. He checked near the walls, still warmer than the outside air temperature, which he knew from experience was well below freezing. 3 hours past midnight, he woke again. The cabin temperature had dropped slightly but remained livable. He wore his nightshirt and felt no urgent need for additional covering. The floor continued radiating stored heat upward. Dawn came 8 hours after the fire had burned out completely. Severin rose and immediately assessed conditions. The cabin was cooler than it had been at midnight, but substantially warmer than outside. Frost covered the window, but no frost formed on interior walls. The water bucket showed no ice. Most remarkably, the floor stones near the ring were still noticeably warm to bare feet. 8 hours without fire. 8 hours of steady heat radiation from thermal mass that had absorbed energy during a 3-hour burn. The system worked better than he had dared hope. The principles he had studied in New Ulm, the design he had obsessed over, the construction neighbors had mocked, all of it validated in a single night. Word spread quickly through the scattered homesteading community that Severin Blackwood had completed his stone floor project and was using it as his primary heating system. The response was immediate skepticism mixed with outright ridicule. Ulrich Brennan made a point of visiting in early November, ostensibly to borrow tools, but actually to see the foolish system in operation. He arrived in late afternoon, examined the stone floor and the ring-shaped fire pit, and delivered his assessment with absolute confidence. "You spent an entire summer building this when I built my whole cabin in 4 days. That proves you have more stubbornness than sense." Other neighbors followed throughout November and early December. Caspar Reinhardt came with his wife Elspeth, curious to see what all the talk was about. They watched Severin build a fire in the ring, let it burn for a few hours, then extinguish it completely. Severin explained the thermal mass principle, how the stones absorbed and stored heat that would radiate through the night. Caspar nodded politely, but his expression showed doubt. "It seems clever in theory, but winter has not truly arrived yet. Wait until January, when temperatures stay below zero for weeks. Then we will see if your stone floor keeps you warm." Barnabas Thorne, the educated English settler whose opinion carried weight in the community, visited in mid-December. He examined the construction with genuine interest, recognizing the engineering principles at work. He acknowledged that the concept was sound and the execution showed skill, but he questioned the practicality. The labor investment was enormous. The system required specific materials and careful construction that most settlers could not replicate. Even if it worked perfectly, was the improvement worth months of effort? A traditional fireplace required tending, but it was simple, cheap, and reliable. The practical criticisms multiplied. What happens when stones crack from repeated heating and cooling? How do you repair the floor if something goes wrong? What if the shallow fire pit fills with ash and stops working? The questions came from genuine concern mixed with the human tendency to resist unfamiliar ideas. Innovation challenged the accepted way of doing things. If Severin's method was superior, that implied everyone else had been doing it wrong. Few people welcomed that implication. Severin responded by simply continuing to use his system. Through December and into the coldest part of winter, he maintained his routine. 1 fire per day, burned for 3 to 4 hours in late afternoon. No fire tending at night. He slept through darkness without waking, something no other settler in the territory could claim. His wood consumption was a fraction of what neighbors used. While Ulrich burned through a cord of wood every 10 days, Severin used a cord every month. But the mockery continued because the innovation was too different, too labor-intensive, and too threatening to established practices. Severin's stone floor became known throughout the region as Blackwood's Folly, an example of what happened when someone with more ambition than common sense decided to reinvent something that did not need reinventing. The judgment seemed final until a February blizzard changed everything. The blizzard arrived on February 9th, 1854, without warning. Temperature dropped 20 degrees in 2 hours. Wind rose to speeds that made standing upright dangerous. Snow fell so heavily that visibility disappeared completely beyond 10 feet. Settlers who had lived through many winters recognized immediately that this storm was different. This was the kind of weather that killed people who made mistakes or ran out of supplies or lost their fires at the wrong moment. Caspar Reinhardt's cabin sat a quarter-mile from Severin's homestead. Caspar had prepared adequately for normal winter conditions. He had 2 cords of split wood stacked outside. His fireplace was well maintained. His family had food and water. But the blizzard lasted longer and burned colder than anyone anticipated. By the second night, Caspar faced a crisis. His wood supply was depleting faster than expected because the extreme cold required constant large fires to maintain even marginal warmth inside the cabin. He rationed carefully, but mathematics were unforgiving. He had enough wood for 1 more night at current consumption rates. If the storm continued into a 3rd day, he would have nothing left to burn. The temperature inside his cabin hovered barely above freezing, despite the fire burning continuously. His wife Elspeth wrapped young Anselm in every blanket they owned. The child was showing signs of dangerous cold exposure, lethargic and confused. Caspar made a calculation. He could burn his remaining wood and hope the storm ended before morning, or he could seek help from the nearest neighbor. Severin was a quarter-mile away. The distance was short in normal conditions, but potentially deadly in a blizzard. Caspar made the journey, fighting wind that tried to push him off course, stumbling through snow that had drifted waist-deep in places. He arrived at Severin's door half-frozen, barely able to knock. Severin opened immediately, pulled him inside, and the difference was shocking. The cabin was warm, not adequately heated, actually comfortable. Caspar stared at the fire ring. No flames burned. The stones showed no visible heat, but warmth radiated from the floor throughout the entire space. Severin had fired his system once that morning, a 4-hour burn that ended 6 hours ago. The thermal mass was releasing stored heat exactly as designed. Caspar could barely form words through his shivering. His family was freezing. His wood was nearly gone. He needed help. Severin responded immediately. He gathered wood from his surplus supply, helped Caspar load it onto a sledge, and together they made the dangerous journey back to Caspar's cabin. Elspeth and young Anselm were brought to Severin's home, where they could recover in genuine warmth. The blizzard ended the next morning. 3 days of brutal cold that had pushed every settler to their limits. Caspar stood in Severin's cabin at dawn, watching his son sleep comfortably on the bed platform. The floor was still warm. No fire had burned through the entire night. He looked at the stone floor that everyone had mocked, understanding finally what Severin had built. Not a curiosity or an eccentricity, a system that could save lives when everything else failed. Spring 1854 brought conversations that would have been impossible a season earlier. Caspar Reinhardt told the story of the blizzard survival to everyone who would listen. The narrative was simple and undeniable. His family had been hours from freezing, while Severin's cabin remained warm enough for comfortable sleep with no active fire burning. The stone floor heating system was not theoretical anymore. It was proven technology that had demonstrated superiority under the most demanding conditions imaginable. Ulrich Brennan visited in April with questions instead of mockery. He asked about construction methods, stone selection, the dimensions of the fire ring, the depth of the floor base. His pride prevented direct apology for months of ridicule, but his questions revealed changed perspective. Severin answered everything honestly, explaining thermal mass principles, demonstrating how heat spread through the floor, sharing the lessons he had learned during construction. He emphasized that the system required significant labor, but no specialized skills or unavailable materials. Any settler with determination could build the same thing. Over the next 2 years, 5 families in the surrounding territory constructed stone floor heating systems. Each adapted the design to their specific circumstances and available materials. Barnabas Thorne built a smaller version in a hunting cabin he maintained 15 miles north. Caspar Reinhardt dedicated an entire summer to building a system nearly identical to Severin's. A family newly arrived from Pennsylvania heard about the heated floors and incorporated the design into their cabin from the beginning, rather than retrofitting existing structure. Not everyone adopted the innovation. Some settlers still considered the labor excessive relative to benefits. Others lacked access to suitable stone. Traditional fireplaces remained the dominant heating method across the frontier. But those who faced the harshest winter conditions or who had experienced close calls with dying fires recognized the value. The stone floor systems became known as reliable solutions for people who needed absolute certainty that their families would stay warm through the night. Ezekiel Moss, the trader, mentioned heated stone floors to settlers he encountered throughout the territory. The concept spread through word of mouth, carried by people who had seen the systems working or heard credible accounts from those who used them. Barnabas Thorne, who kept detailed journals, documented the design with drawings and notes that he shared with incoming settlers seeking advice on frontier construction. Severin's cabin became a reference point. People building their own systems would visit to examine his construction, ask questions about problems they encountered, verify their understanding of principles. He never charged for his time or knowledge. The innovation had saved his family. If it could save others, that justified every hour of labor he had invested. Years passed. Severin and Rosamond raised Anselm and 2 more children in the cabin with the stone floor. They never again experienced the terror of a dying fire on a freezing night. The stones that Severin had hauled and placed so carefully continued performing their function decade after decade, requiring no maintenance, no repairs, no improvements. The best innovations required no new materials or revolutionary technology. They required only deeper understanding of old principles applied with care and intelligence. Severin had not invented thermal mass or discovered that stone retained heat. He had simply recognized that a floor could be more than a surface to walk on. It could be a heating system that worked while you slept.